every day. And my mother never cursed. I, this is the truth. I know you think I'm making this up. My mother, I have no recollection of my mother ever saying a curse word in her entire life. My mother didn't drink. She didn't smoke, you know, but she also was not a particularly religious person. Like at Christmas and Easter, we might go to church. And I think that had something to do with my grandfather not being particularly religious, you know. But my grandmother and her sister Joan were very religious, and they went to church every Sunday. They went to Mount Calvary Baptist Church in Newark, which is still there, but they were with the original pastor of that church, Reverend Mapson, before that big grand building was built on Hawthorne and Seymour when he had a storefront church down on Prince Street. They were with him. So they were with him and saw that church grow and everything. But my mother was very passive.
So what was her reaction to
Well,
being
this
told?
is what I'm trying to get to now. My mother was very passive. So when the conductor came and told us we had to move, my mother and Joan was starting to move, but her sister Gladys was a hellraiser. She was the opposite of my mother. This is why I remember that episode. Had we just moved and gone, I probably wouldn't even remember it. But my sister Gladys was like, I mean, my mother's sister Gladys was like the, I guess today they would say radical. I don't know what they would say back then, but today they would say she was radical. You know, she was the radical one. And she raised so much that, and to tell you, because I was a kid, I really couldn't understand what the dispute was. Like nobody sat there and told me that this was all about segregation on buses and trains. You know, all I remember was all this arguing and everything. But finally, we had to relent because the conductor said they were going to put us off, and I think they gave in because I don't think they had money to buy another ticket for the train. You know, so I remember that. But I remember that because it was a big confrontation. It really didn't unfold itself as an issue of racial segregation until later on in life when I started to grapple with those issues.
And would have that been in the late 60s?
No,
Just prior?
this was well, yes, in the late '60s. That's when I began to grapple with that. So that happened. I remembered it. Stayed with me as a controversy, as a confrontation. But it wasn't until the summer of 1967 that I really had my first discussion, family discussion. I mean, my family discussed with me because the rebellion happened. I believe it was the night of July 12th, 1967. And the rebellion started literally probably a mile as the crow flies, like 1 mile as the crow flies from where we lived on 12th Street. It started with the arrest of the cab driver, John Smith, I believe his name was, on the corner of Fairmount and Tremont. And he was arrested there, and then he was taken to the 17th Avenue precinct. A demonstration followed his arrest, a confrontation with the police and the demonstrators, and that was what started the rebellion because that confrontation, that precinct was literally located in the Hayes Homes project, which was one of the biggest public housing projects in Newark. So that all the ingredients were there for an explosion, and the arrest of Smith was the fuse. And but this explosion didn't contain itself to Springfield Avenue. It spread throughout the black community. I can't say that it necessarily spread throughout Newark because I'm pretty sure it didn't go down into the East Ward or at least past beyond Elizabeth Avenue because that was a black community back then too, Hawthorne. The White Castle was on Hawthorne and Seymour. I mean Hawthorne and Elizabeth. But it contained itself basically within Black Newark. But there were many avenues back in the 50s and early 60s. Many of the avenues were commercial strips. You know, 16th Avenue, I lived on 12th Street near the corner of 12th and 16th. 16th Avenue had stores all the way up to where Newark bordered Irvington and all the way down to where 16th Avenue ran into Springfield Avenue. And so the rebellion was happening. Even our street, we lived directly across the street from a dry goods warehouse. So I was, this was the summer of 1967. I had just graduated from South 17th Street School after being thrown out of school, by the way. I was thrown out of school in the 8th grade, and it wasn't because of political activity, you know? And they let me back in school, and I graduated. My mother had to come and beg the principal to let me come back to school and to graduate. So I graduated. So in July, I was at a little house party across the street at my friend Willie C's house. Now Willie C was one of these kids that had been sent up north. He was up here visiting with his people. So we were at this party and somebody ran upstairs and said Springfield Avenue is on fire, you know, and we all ran downstairs and we were all getting ready to run down. Well, we started running down 12th Street, but my mother was across the street on the porch, told me to get my butt back upstairs, and that was good because who knows what, maybe I would have been one of those 26 or more people who were killed in the rebellion. So our 3-family apartment house had a porch. The first floor had a porch, but the second and third floor porches were like balconies. So the first floor had a porch, but you had a balcony, you know, porch type in the other 2 floors. And so we're sitting there and we're watching, man. The whole neighborhood, it seemed like the whole neighborhood was out in the street. And you know, the warehouse that we lived across the street had these huge bay type doors for trucks to come in and load and unload. Man, people took those doors off the hinges. And so I'm watching this, right? And my grandfather's on the porch, my mother's on the porch. I don't know if my grandmother was on the porch, but I know my mother and my grandfather were sitting on the porch. It's hot. And I asked my grandfather, I said, Papa, why is everybody so upset? Why are they doing this? And so my grandfather, he didn't start the discussion with Newark. He started the discussion with his service in the military, talking about how when he was in the army and they went to France, and how when they got off the boat and they went into town, and how the French people insulted them and were asking to see their tails and all this other stuff. I was like, tails? You know what? And that was the real first discussion I ever heard about race, the night of the rebellion. And they had to. They couldn't hide it. If they were hiding it on purpose. I'm not even sure they were purposefully hiding it, you know. But that was the first discussion.
So his point was, this was a particular expression of something that was just global.
Right. He was trying to illustrate to me how race affected people on a real personal level and why people would be mad, you know. And it wasn't a long discussion. He didn't give me no lecture. He wasn't a professor of politics, but he was talking about his life.
But he distilled everything.
Right.
And he's your father figure,
Right, that's
essentially.
right.
Yeah.
His name was Claude Cobb. My grandfather was Claude Cobb. My grandmother was Stella Cobb. My Aunt Joan, well, she was Joan Hill. She had married James Hill, who by this time was deceased. Um, my grandfather was a tall, very dark skinned man, very dark skinned man, and he hated the South. I didn't know this until we had this discussion.
Was he from the
He
South
was
originally?
from the South. He hated the South so much that he told my mother that he did not want to be buried down south. In fact, he told my mother, he said, if you put my body on the train, I'm going to get up off the train and come back.
Well, Larry, so do you think that this was a heartbreak for him to see this happen in the
I
North,
don't,
or do you think he believed that it was necessary to
I
happen?
don't know. I want to be truthful. The discussion was not that deep. It was not, my grandfather was not a flaming militant. As I said, I don't have any recollection of them being in the NAACP, or I didn't even know about the NAACP till after I graduated high school, all of that. My grandfather was a hardworking man. He worked all his life. He got sick, didn't go to work for about 2 weeks, and then he died. He's buried about 3 miles from here. As the crow flies, he's buried in Glendale, in the Glendale Cemetery in Belleville, in the veteran section. He was a veteran. He's buried about 5 rows from my father, Lawrence Hamm, who's buried in that same section. My grandfather was a World War One veteran. My grand my father was a World War II veteran. And it's deep to look down on a headstone and see your name, because I have my father's name, like, you know, but they're buried literally a couple of rows from each other.
And that's your mother's father.
Right, my mother's
Right.
father, my grandfather, and her husband,
Hmm.
Lawrence Hamm, her husband. They're both buried there. So that was really the rebellion. Was really the first kind of racial discussion, and it kind of kept going, because like all the news was about Newark, all the news was about the quote unquote riots. I mean, you couldn't escape it. Like the television programs we watched regularly, we had to see, and that was really kind of the beginning. The second thing that happened very closely to that, because that fall, July, was the rebellion. What's amazing? How quickly things went back to normal.
So the National Guard comes into town.
National Guard. I
You have
saw the guard.
multiple
I
casualties.
saw the guard come in. I saw the guard roll. I saw contingents of National Guard marching and rolling up 16th Avenue. I saw half track. You know what a half track is? It's a little tank for one person to sit in, and it has a barrel on it, but it's like a little. I guess that's why they call it half. A half track. But it has a big cannon on it. It's a little. I saw half tracks. I saw jeeps. I saw trucks with soldiers, just like in the World War II movies. They would come. They set up what looked like to be the little operation right at the intersection of 16th Street, 16th Avenue and 12th Street. Like martial law was declared. We couldn't leave our house for several days, and then when we left the house, they were searching the car. Opening the car, looking in the cars. Guardsmen went door to door. Um, I guess to see if people had stolen goods. I guess we were under military occupation for about 2 weeks. I guess I think the guard pulled out about 2 weeks after that. And what's amazing is how quickly, like when this happened, what my thought was as a kid, right? Oh, we're not gonna start school in September, but we did start school in September, like right on time. I remember in August, a couple of weeks when After things had calmed down, I went down to Springfield Avenue. I never forget the whole air. Like if you ever go to a fire, you see like a house on fire. After they put their fire out, there's that distinct smell of burning wood. You know, that smell was everywhere. Everywhere. Like you couldn't walk away from it. And glass was everywhere. You couldn't step anywhere. But by September, things were back to normal. They weren't normal, but the veneer, the facade of normality was there. So,
But you mentioned the second thing.
I'm-
That would have been the assassination of Dr. King
no,
and the
nope,
aftermath. No?
nope, nope. The second thing was at Arts High School. So I started Arts. I didn't want to go to Arts High School. I wanted to go to West Side with my friends. But in the spring of '67, I got into some trouble. I was throwing rocks at the school, broke out some school windows, and got expelled. My mother had to come back, bring me back. It was the first time I saw my mother cry like that. My father died, my mother cried, but she didn't boo-hoo like she did in front of the principal, whose name, by the way, was Mr. King. You know, begged that man to let me back into school. He told my mother, I never forget this, he said, Miss Hamm, you know, we thought your son was a good kid, but he's a common hoodlum. That's what he told my mother in front of me. He said, your son is a common hoodlum. And, but they let me back in. You know, if I had done that today, I might have went to jail. It's very interesting when I look back at some of these events, how they unfolded. You know, because I mean, racism was virulent at that time. It's still virulent, but you know, this was like during the civil rights movement. You know, Dr. King was still alive in 1967, but this white principal, he didn't. I never saw the police. I don't know if they filed a police report on me or not. I never saw police. I never was interviewed with the police. They didn't take me to the police station. They expelled me, gave me a paper, said, you're expelled, you can't come back. When you come back, you got to come back with your mother. I guess the paper said when I was to come back and everything. So I had a teacher, her name was Miss Ryerson. She was a white teacher. I don't know exactly where she was from, but I would guess, I'm just guessing, she seemed to be very like New England. I don't think she was from Newark. She was very like, I'm just guessing here that she might have been from.
People not from New Jersey
That-
tend to stand out.
Yeah, she was very
around
New
here.
England. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, we had white people in Newark, but anyway, she knew I knew how to read music. And she tried to get me to take the test to go to Arts High in the fall, and I didn't take it. And then after the suspension, I came back. I guess she was trying to redeem me, to rehabilitate me. So she got me to take the test for Arts High School. And I passed because I could read music. And I could read music because I wanted to play the guitar. When I was a kid, I asked my grandfather. My grandfather took me to a sign painter who gave music lessons in the back of his shop in the evenings. And that's where I learned music.